Hello, YouTube fam. Get ready for an amazing video experience. We're thrilled to present to you our video dedicated to international reactions to the Saudi Arabian-led intervention in Yemen present. Enjoy. International reactions to the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen of 2015 were mixed. Most other Arab League nations and several Western governments backed the Saudi Arabia-led military coalition, but other governments warned against an escalation in the violent situation in Yemen. Get ready for a captivating exploration as we unravel the layers of supranational and their profound significance. Delegates to the Arab League voted to study the formation of a joint military force on 29 March 2015, days after the intervention in Yemen began. Secretary-General Nasser al-Arabi affirmed that the intervention would continue until Houthi militias withdraw and submit their weapons and asserted that the international operation was necessary. The European Union criticized the military intervention. It suggested that military intervention would not solve the crisis and expressed concern about the serious regional repercussions after the Saudi military intervention in Yemen, describing that this move is not a solution, and urging regional powers to act responsibly. The European Union reiterates its support for all efforts by the United Nations. Soukayyad Madani, Secretary-General of the OIC, criticized the Houthis and said military action was made inevitable by their actions. He said he hoped the intervention would restore stability to Yemen. Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, warned that Yemen appeared to be verging on total collapse. He expressed concern about civilian casualties, including those apparently caused by a Saudi airstrike on a camp for displaced persons in northern Yemen. Russia called an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council for April 2015 to discuss calling for humanitarian pauses in the airstrikes. A leaked UN report of January 2016 found that the Saudi coalition had conducted airstrikes that had targeted civilians, including camps for internally displaced people, weddings, schools, religious centers, hospitals, vehicles, and markets. Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, the UN's Commissioner for Human Rights, told the UN Security Council that the Saudi coalition is responsible for a disproportionate number of attacks on civilian areas. UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Yemen, Johannes van der Kloe, said Saudi-led airstrikes violate international law. Without wasting any more time, let's jump into the fascinating world of national. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan government announced its support for the military intervention by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Algeria, Ramtin Lamamra, expressed very great and deep concern about the events in Yemen and said the escalation of violence would only make the situation worse. Lamamra reportedly presented a ceasefire initiative at an Arab League summit in Egypt, calling for the Houthis to withdraw from Sana'a and the Yemeni House of Representatives to resume meeting in exchange for an end to the bombing campaign and security guarantees for the Houthis and their allies. On April 14, 2015, Australian Foreign Affairs Minister Julie Bishop said she shared the view of UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon in calling for a ceasefire. She believes all parties involved in the conflict in Yemen should go back to the negotiating table. The Foreign Ministry said in a statement that Bangladesh deplored acts of violence perpetrated by Houthis on the people of Yemen, resulting in humanitarian crisis. Bangladesh supports all efforts led by Saudi Arabia in restoring the legitimate state authority and realization of aspirations of the people of Yemen, as well as upholding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Yemen, it said. Bangladesh also urged for resumption of political process guided by the commitments made by the parties within the Gulf Cooperation Council framework, the National Dialogue Conference outcomes and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. On 27 March 2015, Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Rob Nicholson issued a statement on the situation in Yemen, saying Canada supports the military action by Saudi Arabia and its Gulf Cooperation Council partners and others to defend Saudi Arabia's border and to protect Yemen's recognized government. At the request of the Yemeni president, the Chinese government expressed deep concern over the situation in Yemen. It urged all parties to resolve the dispute through dialogue. Djibouti supports foreign military intervention in Yemen and is prepared to help evacuate its nationals if the security situation there deteriorates, said Foreign Minister Mahmoud Ali Yusuf. Yusuf warned on 2 April 2015 that the Houthis had installed heavy weapons on islands in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and he urged coalition forces to remove them, saying they endangered Djibouti and international shipping. In a statement, the Eritrean Foreign Ministry said it viewed the Yemeni crisis as an internal matter. Eritrea denied allegations that it provided support to the Houthis. In late April, Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki visited Saudi Arabia for talks on bilateral relations and the situation in Yemen. The two countries reportedly reached a security and martial accord centered on counter-terrorism, illicit trade and maritime security in the Red Sea area, as well as averting foreign interference in Yemen's internal affairs. Ethiopian Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn said his country stands with Sudan, a neighbor and member of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. He said the intervention was justified to protect the Yemeni government and defeat the Houthis. According to the Saudi newspaper, Arab News, the French embassy in Riyadh released a statement reiterating its support of Haiti's government and concluding, France stands by its partners in the region to restore stability and unity of Yemen. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius expressed his political support for the Saudi-led intervention during an official visit to Riyadh. In May 2019, however, French Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian urged Saudi Arabia and UAE to stop the dirty war in Yemen. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German foreign minister, said he can understand Saudi Arabia's decision to mount a military intervention, and acknowledged the operation had support from the region and was carried out at Yemeni President Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi's request. However, he said the crisis could not be solved by violence and urged a negotiated solution. On 2 December 2015, the Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, warned that Saudi Arabia was at risk of becoming a major destabilizing influence in the Arab world, adding that Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen was driven by a desire to show that the country was willing to take military, financial and political risks in order not to fall behind in regional politics. Religious Affairs Minister Luqman Hakim Saifin expressed concerns over the military intervention and hoped that it would end soon and wouldn't worsen. Foreign Minister Mohammed Javad Zarif called the military intervention a dangerous development which will destabilize a region, and the Foreign Ministry demanded an immediate halt on all military aggressions in Yemen. Iran described and warned that Riyadh was taking a dangerous step, making clear that the Saudi deployment of a Sunni coalition against Shiite enemies would complicate efforts to end a conflict, and that it was likely to inflame the sectarian animosities fueling wars around the Middle East. A senior official said military intervention in Yemen is not an option for Tehran. We demand an immediate stop to the Saudi military operations in Yemen, Mohammed Javad Zarif said in an interview with Iran's Arabic-language Al-Alam news network, according to Press TV. According to Iran's official news agency, Iran's deputy foreign minister has asked the United Nations Secretary-General to do everything possible to halt Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen immediately. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei denounced the Saudi bombings, calling them acts of genocide. He went on to say that Saudi Arabia will not emerge victorious in its aggression. Khamenei also compared Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen to Israel's military operation in Gaza last summer. Foreign Minister Ibrahim al-Jafari expressed the Iraqi government's opposition to the intervention at an Arab League summit on 26 March. On 29 March 2015, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu criticized Iran's purported support for the Houthis, saying that Iran-Yemen axis is very dangerous for humanity and needs to be stopped, in a reference to ongoing nuclear negotiations between Iran and the Lebanese Prime Minister Tamim Salam's reaction to the intervention was described by Beirut-based newspaper The Daily Star as ambiguous. Salam said at an Arab League summit on 28 March 2015 that Lebanon backs any Arab stance that preserves Yemen's sovereignty and territorial integrity in addition to the cohesion of its social fabric. He also asked the Arab League not to involve Lebanon in any regional struggles, an apparent reference to the conflict. Said Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary-General of the Lebanese Hezbollah, in a 27 March 2015 speech strongly censured Saudi Arabia for its aggression against Yemen. He claimed that Saudis decided to invade Yemen because they realized they were losing their influence and control over the country. He praised Iran for respecting the will of the region's people and sympathizing with their causes. He further accused Saudi Arabia of betraying the struggle against Israel as the main Arab cause. Nasrallah said Hezbollah would have joined the fight if it were against Israel, rather than Arabs. Saud Hariri, former Prime Minister of Lebanon, praised Saudi King Salman for what he described as his wise and brave decision for military operation against the Houthi rebels. He blamed Iran's intervention in regional conflicts for the current turmoil in the region and supported Saudi Arabia for uniting the Arabs by the action it is carrying out in Yemen. Internationally recognized Libyan Prime Minister Abdullah Al-Thani compared the conflict in Yemen to the fractious political situation in his country and said it is impossible to support legitimacy in Yemen and not do the same thing in Libya. Malaysia's Minister of Defense, Hishamuddin Hussein, has affirmed his country's support to Yemen's government and Saudi Arabia's measures to protect its security and sovereignty. New Zealand's Deputy Foreign Minister, Bede Curry, supported Iran's plan for sending humanitarian aid, promoting cessation of hostilities and national dialogue and unity government in the country on April 14. Despite being a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Oman has decided not to join the coalition, but is providing humanitarian aid to Yemenis. The Omani government has said that it had helped nationals from 48 countries leave Yemen and return to their home countries, and that it had taken in 2,695 refugees from Yemen as of mid-April. After Saudi disclosures about Pakistan's participation, it was reported that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif had reaffirmed that any risk to Saudi Arabia's territorial integrity would evoke a strong response from Pakistan, but that Pakistan is not directly participating in the military intervention. The Pakistani parliament voted to adopt a policy of neutrality toward the conflict in Yemen, rebuffing a direct request from Saudi Arabia to commit troops and aircraft to the operation. However, on 17 April, Sharif said Pakistan would dispatch warships to enforce the arms embargo against the Houthis in support of the Saudi-led coalition. Pakistan's left-wing opposition and the Pakistan People's Party has warned against participating in the conflict, advising the ruling Conservative Party, the PLN, to restore peace and not to participate in war. Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, another major political party, has condemned the military intervention in Yemen. In a press release by Foreign Office's spokeswoman, Tasnim Aslam, Pakistan has refused to be a part of any military campaign that divides the Muslim Ummah, hence adopting a strict neutrality in the conflict. A senior official in the Sharif ministry confirmed the policy of neutrality in the conflict, quoting, "Pakistan will not be involved in any action in Yemen itself but will provide support to the Saudis on their own soil if they are threatened." Many in Pakistan protested against the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen, and popular public opinion is opposed to any support of the military intervention. News media in Pakistan is speculating that Pakistan will not take part in the Sunni-led campaign against the Shiite Houthis in Yemen, as Pakistan has a sizable Shia following and enjoys cordial relations with Iran and China, who strongly opposed the military intervention. In addition, Pakistan has stronger ties and historical relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, maintaining a balance with both states. In a session with Parliament, Defense Minister Khawaja Asif remarked, "We are not and will not fan any conflict that will divide the Muslim world on sectarian lines." Although the Pakistan government repeatedly rejected the claims, numerous foreign news media reported that Pakistan was a participant in the coalition force and quoted an unnamed senior government official. Saudi Arabia asked for both material and manpower support from Pakistan. This request was made when National Security Advisor Sata Aziz, Special Convoy Tariq Fatmi, and Defense Minister Mohammed Asif paid an urgent visit to Saudi Arabia. Despite Saudi pressure on Pakistan, Prime Minister Sharif made an emergency trip to Turkey to discuss the issue and to address security issues in Yemen. According to the Foreign Ministry's officials, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif paid an urgent visit to Islamabad on 8 April 2015 to discuss the issue in Yemen. Pakistan's parliament participated in a broader debate over the complexity and issues involving Saudi Arabia's request, and on 8 April 2016, the Mutwa Liberal Party has spoken out against getting involved in Yemen, with MQM Senator Tahir Hussein Mashudi stating that the aggressor was Saudi Arabia and the victims were the Yemenis. The Palestinian National Authority announced their support of what they called the Arab Coalition and said a similar coalition should be created against Hamas, who, it claimed, had illegally taken over the Gaza Strip during a 2007 coup. Hamas. On 30 March 2015, Hamas announced its support of the Saudi-led coalition. Since at least 2021, however, Hamas has supported and recognized the Houthi movement. Sabirine movement, the group's leader, who is a Shiite convert and supported by Iran, condemned the Saudi intervention and called it an attack on the Yemeni people. President Vladimir Putin sent a letter to the Arab League calling for an immediate cessation of military activities in Yemen. The Kremlin also recommended increased efforts to find a peaceful solution to the crisis. Russia introduced a draft resolution to the UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire on April 4. President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed indicated that the federal government of Somalia supported the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen. In response to calls from Yemeni President Abdrabbu Mansur for a collective counter-insurgency effort on the part of the Arab League states, Mohammed also noted that the nation would continue to stand by the Yemeni government. Foreign Minister of Somalia, Abdisalam Omar, reiterated his administration's support for the legitimacy of Yemen's incumbent government. He officially confirmed that the Somali federal government had permitted the coalition to use Somalia's airspace, territorial waters and land. It offered to share its stabilization-related experience with the Saudi-led forces. The approval came after Somalia had leased its airspace to the Gulf states, with Bosaso in the northeast and Berbera in the northwest scheduled to be used by the coalition forces due to their proximity to Yemen. The separatist administration of the Somaliland Autonomous Region in northwestern Somalia objected to the Somali federal government's decision, arguing that it was an independent administration and that the waters fell under its jurisdiction. The Syrian Foreign Ministry expressed deep concern over the situation in Yemen. While Syria stressed the need to respect the sovereignty of Yemen and its independence, it called on all Yemeni parties to embark on a dialogue to reach a political solution that meets the aspirations and will of the Yemeni people. The foreign minister, in a press statement, said that they are concerned about the serious developments in Yemen and urged for dialogues. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that Turkey supported the Saudi-led military operation in Yemen. He also criticized Iran's regional ambitions in both Yemen and Iraq. However, in a joint meeting between Iran and Turkey, both nations agreed that a political solution is needed in Yemen. Despite being on opposing sides of the conflict, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office announced support for the Saudi decision to intervene militarily in Yemen following President Hadi's request for support. However, the UK said it would not be providing military support, though it later emerged that the UK had sent military advisors to help direct coalition attacks. A National Security Council spokeswoman said the US would work jointly with Saudi Arabia to provide military and intelligence support while not participating in direct military action. President Barack Obama declared that he had authorized U.S. forces to provide logistical and intelligence support to the operation against Houthis as a joint planning cell with Saudi Arabia. U.S. support has included UAV video feeds to aid Saudi airstrike targeting, refueling of Saudi fighter aircraft, and search and rescue support in the Gulf of Aden. Rehalf, a spokeswoman for the U.S. State Department, said in April 2015, that the parties to the conflict should end the fighting and restart a political dialogue. In the wake of a leaked UN report highly critical of the coalition and of ongoing attacks on civilian targets, the US issued an unusual statement that criticized airstrikes that killed an ambulance driver working with Doctors Without Borders and a journalist, while making no mention of Saudi Arabia or the coalition. In the upcoming section, we'll be shining a light on others. Red Cross. The International Committee of the Red Cross is worried by the recent escalation of violence in Yemen, and expressed concern on March 26, 2015 at reports of civilian casualties following airstrikes in the capital Sana'a and other parts of the country. Edric Schweizer, head of the ICRC delegation in Yemen, stated all parties involved in the current round of violence are bound by the rules governing the conduct of hostilities. Médecins Sans Frontières. Doctors Without Borders have condemned airstrikes on multiple occasions. Ban Ki-moon also condemned attacks on MSF facilities on 3 December 2015. International Crisis Group. The ICG concluded in the 27 March 2015 briefing that action by the UNSC to observe a prompt truce, with the aim of restoring the suspended negotiations, was needed. The ICG has also recommended priorities for negotiations, namely having Saudi Arabia persuade Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi to give up power and holding talks in neutral Oman. Oxfam. On April 19, 2015, International Aid Agency, Oxfam, condemned Saudi Arabia over airstrikes that it said had hit one of its warehouses containing humanitarian supplies in the Houthi northern stronghold of Sodar. Amnesty International. Amnesty has said that the coalition's airstrikes demonstrate an appalling disregard for civilian life, with some attacks amounting to war crimes. Reporters Without Borders. Reporters Without Borders condemned a strike in Sana'a on 20 April 2015 that caused the deaths of 4 employees of Al Yemen Al Yum TV and injured 10 others. It also condemned attacks on journalists by pro-Houthi forces. Human Rights Watch criticized the UN Security Council repeatedly for remaining almost silent on coalition abuses. UNESCO condemned the destructions by airstrikes on the old city of Sana'a, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and other heavily populated areas. Brace yourself for a captivating discussion on evacuations and other actions as we explore its nuances and implications. The Royal Saudi Navy evacuated diplomats and United Nations staff from Aden to Jeddah on 28 March 2015. Pakistan dispatched 2 special PIA flights to evacuate some 500 stranded Pakistanis on 29 March 2015. Several UN staff members and Arab diplomats were also evacuated following the airstrikes. The Indian government responded by deploying ships and planes to Yemen to evacuate stranded Indians. Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj stated that since all the airports in Yemen were closed, they planned to bring people to the neighboring country of Djibouti by ship, and from there to India by aircraft. India began evacuating hundreds of its citizens on 2 April 2015 via a commercial liner docked in Aden port. An air evacuation of Indian nationals from Sana'a to Djibouti was carried out on 3 April 2015, after the Indian government obtained permission to land 2 Airbuses at the airport. The Indian Armed Forces, in a rescue operation codenamed Operation Riot, evacuated more than 4,640 Indian nationals along with 960 foreign nationals from 41 countries. The operation ended on 11 April 2015. A Chinese missile frigate docked in Aden on 29 March 2015 to evacuate Chinese nationals from Yemen. The ship reportedly deployed soldiers ashore on 2 April 2015 to guard the evacuation of civilians from the city. The Chinese frigate evacuated 225 foreign citizens from 10 different countries in what Reuters described as the first time that China's military has helped other countries evacuate their people during an international crisis. China also evacuated 571 of its own nationals and 8 foreigners who worked for Chinese companies in Yemen. The Ethiopian Foreign Ministry said it would airlift its citizens out of Yemen if they requested to be evacuated. There were reportedly more than 50,000 Ethiopian nationals living and working in Yemen at the outbreak of hostilities. Malaysia also planned to evacuate its 879 citizens from Yemen, according to its foreign minister, Anifah Oman, but it was unclear whether they would be moved out by air or land. In this segment, we'll be unraveling the complexities of timeline of events and exploring its multifaceted nature. On 4 April 2015, the ICRC called for a 24-hour humanitarian ceasefire after the coalition blocked 3 aid shipments to Yemen. Russia also called for humanitarian pauses in the coalition bombing campaign, bringing the idea before the United Nations Security Council in a 4 April emergency meeting. However, Saudi Arabia's UN ambassador raised questions over whether humanitarian pauses are the best way of delivering humanitarian assistance. On 7 April, China renewed calls for an immediate ceasefire. On 10 April, Julian Heine's UNICEF Yemen representative said to CNN, "The humanitarian situation is worsening all the time, with increasingly limited access to water, basic sanitation and critical health services." As a result, UNICEF sent antibiotics, bandages, syringes, IV sets and other medical supplies. On 10 April, the Pakistani parliament declined a Saudi Arabian request to join the coalition. The parliament clarified the wish to maintain a neutral diplomatic stance. On 14 April, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution placing an arms embargo on 3 top Houthi leaders, including Abdul Malik al-Houthi, as well as Soleh and his son, Ahmed Ali Soleh. The embargo also covered their supporters and called on the Houthis to retreat and lay down arms. Other provisions in the resolution include appointing UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon to facilitate the provision of aid, including humanitarian pauses. It also called on all involved parties to participate in peace talks in Riyadh. The resolution was sponsored by the Gulf states and Jordan, which held a rotating Security Council seat. On 16 April, the UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Jamal Benima, resigned, citing his failure to negotiate and enter the conflicts. Benima brokered the post-Arab Spring transition in which Haiti replaced Soleh. Following the resignation, Secretary-General Ban called for an immediate ceasefire to facilitate the delivery of aid. On 16 April, a group of US and UK-based Yemen scholars wrote an open letter stating that the operation was illegal under international law and calling for the UN to enforce an immediate ceasefire. On 17 April, Iran submitted to the United Nations a 4-point peace proposal aimed at ending the conflict. The proposal called for an immediate ceasefire and end of all foreign military attacks, humanitarian assistance, a resumption of broad national dialogue and establishment of an inclusive national unity government. Exiled Yemeni officials later rejected the deal, calling it a political maneuver. Russia confirmed its backing of the proposal and said that it would use its full capacity to further the plan. The UN on 17 April called for $274 million in humanitarian aid to meet the needs of 7.5 million people over 3 months. The same day, Saudi Arabia pledged to fund the entire appeal. However, the UN agency responsible opted to keep the appeal open, stating that it urged other donors to provide more support to meet increasing needs across the country. On 18 April, the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced that General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, had called King Salman and urged him to increase efforts to find a political solution to end the crisis. On 19 April, Oxfam condemned Saudi Arabia over airstrikes it said hit one of its warehouses containing humanitarian supplies in Sauda. On 21 April, the Iranian foreign minister announced that he was hopeful that a ceasefire would be under effect later in the day. Mauritanian diplomat Ismail al-Sheikh Ahmed was nominated by Secretary-General Ban to replace Jamal Benima, who resigned on 16 April. His nomination was confirmed on 25 April. On 24 April, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation announced it would hold an extraordinary meeting to discuss the situation. Aid groups came out against the air campaign. Amnesty International said some of the coalition's airstrikes appeared to have failed to take necessary precautions to minimize harm to civilians and damage to civilian objects. Reporters Without Borders condemned a strike in Sana'a on 20 April that caused the deaths of 4 employees of Al Yemen Al-Yum TV and injured 10 others. It also condemned attacks on journalists by pro-Houthi forces. On 24 April, thousands of Nigerians demonstrated in Kano following Friday prayers to denounce the Saudi attacks. On 25 April, Professor Sami Ramadani of London Metropolitan University claimed Haiti was violating Yemen's constitution. Under Article 35, no organization, individual, group, political party or organization may establish forces or paramilitary groups for whatever purpose or under any name. Additionally, under Article 68, no other armed force may enter the House premises or take positions near its entrances except at the request of the Speaker. On 27 April, Benama told the Wall Street Journal that Yemeni political parties had been close to agreeing on a final peace deal before the airstrikes started. On 29 April, peace activist group Women's Power to Stop War demanded an end to the conflict and sent letters to over 10 embassies and representatives, denouncing the conflict following a plea by Yemeni activist Amal Bosha. By the end of April, the U.S. government was pressuring Saudi Arabia to end the airstrikes, with National Security Advisor Susan East Rice saying, "There is no military solution to the crisis in Yemen, and the humanitarian situation will only worsen if the conflict continues." Also on 29 April, U.S. State Department spokesperson Marie Harf said the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs Federica Mogherini had discussed the situation, with particular emphasis on pushing forward political negotiations. On 30 April, the ICRC Red Cross and the World Food Programme WFP said a delivery had become difficult to impossible, with WFP suspending operations due to ongoing fighting, air transport restrictions, and the destruction of Sana'a Airport. On 1 May, the UNSC held an emergency meeting, called by Russia, to discuss the crisis. The Council did not agree on a Russian-drafted statement demanding an immediate ceasefire in what the Russian delegate called amazing indecision. Diplomats said they rejected the Russian statement as they needed time to consider the wording. A U.S. official said the U.S. was working directly with the Saudi government to facilitate a delivery, and condemned Houthi and pro-Saleh fighters for failing to abide by an earlier UN resolution calling on them to end fighting. An unnamed diplomat told AFP that diplomats had agreed in principle with the Russian resolution, but failed to agree on the exact wording. On 2 May, Kerry stated that the US, the UN, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were working on peace negotiations between the government and the rebels. On 4 May, the UN called on the coalition to stop attacking Sana'a Airport to allow delivery of humanitarian aid. ICRC head in Yemen, Cedric Schweizer, said the harsh restrictions on importations imposed by the coalition for the past 6 weeks, added to the extreme fuel shortages, have made the daily lives of Yemenis unbearable, and their suffering immense. WFP stated that its monthly fuel needs had increased from 40,000 to 1 million litres. On 6 May, Kerry pledged to discuss the implementation of a humanitarian pause with Saudi officials. Kerry, on a visit to Djibouti, urged all sides to comply with humanitarian law to take every precaution to keep civilians out of the line of fire. On 7 May, after sordious discussions, Saudi Arabia proposed a 5-day ceasefire. 2 Houthi leaders told CNN that they would meet soon to discuss the proposal. Hours later, coalition spokesman said that forces would continue a harsh response to Houthis' attacks on the areas along the kingdom's southern border. On 8 May, the Russian UN envoy said that he expected UN-brokered peace talks to resume quickly and warned that sending ground troops into Yemen would be a reckless escalation. A UN official commented on the recently announced ceasefire, saying that it would not be enough to accommodate Yemen's humanitarian needs, stating that a UN-chartered fuel vessel was still waiting off the coast. On 10 May, The UN humanitarian coordinator for Yemen stated that the attacks on Saudi province were in breach of international law. On 29 June, Secretary-General Ban denounced a coalition airstrike that had hit a UN compound in Aden the previous day and requested a full investigation. On 20 January 2016, Angus Robertson, the parliamentary group leader, said the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, should admit to British involvement in Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. Isn't it time for the Prime Minister to admit that Britain is effectively taking part in a war in Yemen that is costing thousands of civilians lives, and he has not sought parliamentary approval to do this? Remember, knowledge is power. Keep learning, growing, and exploring.